Welcome, everyone. So every month, the Christian Perspective on Liberal Arts Committee hosts a community of learners, a conversation on a particular topic of interest. And it just happened this year this month, that our community of learners fell on Constitution Day. So Constitution Day is a federal observance. All universities do something on this day to remember or think about or discuss the Constitution in some kind of way. And we are doing that today with the subject of Christian nationalism in the US Constitution. And we are joined with Daniel K. Williams. Dr. Williams is a historian, professor of history at West Georgia University. He's the author of numerous important works on American religious history, including God's Own Party, a history of the religious right and Republican Party, Defenders of the Unborn, a wonderful history of the pro-life movement, and a book that a number of SAU students are actually reading this semester, The Politics of the Cross, a Christian alternative to partisanship. So we are very grateful to have Dr. Williams with us today to join us for this conversation. So for this first half hour or so, we will just have a conversation. We have some questions we want to take up, and then we will open it up for general questions from everyone. So our first question, Christian nationalism seems to be growing in importance in our political process. In the 2016-2020 elections, one of the primary identifiers of political party identification was, do you believe the United States was founded as a Christian nation or not? So Christian nationalism as a political identity seems to be as strong as it's ever been in this country. And yet, what do we mean when we talk about Christian nationalism? It seems like that's a pretty slippery term. And there's a lot of different people maybe mean a lot of different things by that. So maybe this is a good place to kind of start our conversation, is when we talk about Christian nationalism, what do we mean? So what would be your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Mark, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So thanks for giving me this opportunity. I think you're right that Christian nationalism is a very slippery term, and I'm sure it does have different meanings to different people. I think that I would probably start with the idea of a covenantal understanding of the nation. This is a fairly narrow definition of Christian nationalism, but I'll start with this, and then we'll talk about maybe some broader Christian nationalist leanings if it's not pure Christian nationalism. But we'll start with maybe what I would view as a fairly strict version of Christian nationalism, and that would be that the United States, as you said, was founded as a Christian nation in this belief, and that the nation therefore has a covenantal relationship with God that is perhaps not identical to, but in some way analogous to, the relationship that ancient biblical Israel had with God. And so therefore the promises that apply to biblical Israel, like some of the promises in Proverbs, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, or in the Psalms, or most famously in that passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, where in Solomon's prayer, if my people who are called by my name call on me, then I will hear them and be their God. And so that idea that the nation has that relationship with God in the same way, or analogous to ancient Israel's relationship with God, and in some way analogous to even an individual's relationship with God. So that is, the nation can be blessed or punished depending on how it responds to God. And that view is something that I think was very much present in the Christian right of the late 1970s and 1980s. Jerry Falwell, for example, founder of the Moral Majority, certainly believed in Christian nationalism. I think Pat Robertson did as well. But they both believed that the nation's fortunes would depend on the nation's behavior in relationship to God. So perhaps the most infamous example of that, widely quoted and maybe taken out of context, but still a good example of this, would be right after 9/11, when Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson were talking and said, this happened because of a list of specific sins, the idea that the nation could be punished. And that was not the first time that they had said that. Jerry Falwell in the late 1970s said that the nation's economic problems, the nation's foreign policy problems with Iran were essentially judgments of God, and that if the nation did not repent, it might not have more than 50 years in his estimate. And therefore, politics became a way to reclaim the nation for God. It wasn't the only way. Evangelism was certainly one method. But because the nation had a unique relationship with God, therefore, some sort of political campaign to outlaw abortion, to restrict gay rights in order to try to reduce the amount of public homosexuality, that sort of political program, or as they would say, putting God back in the public schools, that is, restoring classroom prayer and devotional Bible reading, those were all manifestations of this Christian nationalist belief. Now, alongside that Christian nationalist belief, I think, are some other trappings that appeal to people that might not have this strict covenantal perspective, because I think we probably both agree that some of the people traveling in the Christian nationalist, under the Christian nationalist banner, or that are lumped into this, might not have a strict theological reason for believing it. That is, they might not say, as Jerry Falwell did, that the nation had a special relationship with God for the purpose of evangelizing the world. So Jerry Falwell believed theologically, I would say, with theology that's somewhat heterodox for the conservative evangelical Protestant tradition, but still widely shared. But he believed that that God had a special plan for the United States, that there was a theological American exceptionalism in which America would bless the world, sort of like Israel was supposed to bless the world in also his dispensationalist theology. Now, alongside that, though, is this attraction for a number of people to turn the clock back to a time when supposedly the nation was more overtly Christian and certainly less pluralist. So usually the mythical time that people consciously or unconsciously imagine is a time period of the 1950s, when President Dwight Eisenhower led a prayer at his own inauguration, when the phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, when it seemed that America had a very strong, unified national purpose, which was tied, of course, with the Cold War. And that was linked very closely with what the sociologist Robert Bellah called 50 years ago civil religion. Civil religion is the use of religious symbols to support American nationalism or American patriotism, to support national ideals. And Robert Bellah said that this was not exactly overtly Christian, even from a sociological perspective. So in other words, if you look at the civil religious discourse of American presidents, even Dwight Eisenhower, there's no reference to Jesus. There's nothing that's overtly Trinitarian or overtly Christian, but it is vaguely Christian inspired in the sense that whether it's a vaguely deistic belief or a Christian belief stripped of any sort of uniquely Trinitarian theology, it's still monotheistic. It still relies on the Bible as an authoritative book. Even today, biblical verses crop into inaugural addresses almost without exception. And so civil religion is not identical to Christian nationalism, but there's obviously a relationship there. And there are a number of Americans, I think, that have a nostalgia for that sort of thing, and have an attraction for that sort of thing. And indeed, I've made the analogy before that in its current incarnation, the populist version of Christian nationalism that's not overtly evangelical, but is sort of the version that would say, we need to say Merry Christmas, whatever happened to that phrase, that sort of thing, is very much analogous to the European right. So the European right, for the most part, is not overtly Christian in an evangelical context. Certainly, the evangelicalism doesn't really have a whole lot of presence in European politics, but it often is at least vaguely culturally Christian, especially when it opposes Islam or takes a hard line on immigration from non-Christian areas of the world, to keep Europe culturally Christian in sort of a vague way. And that has fed into Christian nationalism in the United States. And so I do believe that there are people that we might call Christian nationalists who are not Orthodox evangelicals in terms of their theology, but who are attracted to the same sort of cultural idea that has informed the European right.
So it sounds like you're kind of teasing out two tracks for Christian nationalism. One might be, the Puritans had it right. John Winthrop's sermon on the Arabella, very clearly kind of lays out a covenantal relationship between the first colonists and God, and they really saw themselves as new Israel. And you talk about how you saw that expressed even into the 1980s, 1990s, even into the 21st century. But then this other track of Christian nationalism that seems to be more like, hey, weren't the 1950s great? We might call, versus John Winthrop's Christian nationalism, we might call this Archie Bunker's Christian nationalism. Those were the days. Is it possible to kind of separate these kind of two Christian nationalisms today, or do you see both of them still operative today and just kind of feeding off of each other?
I think there's definitely a symbiotic relationship. So I do think that at one level they can be separated, and that would be the theological level. But in terms of a practical level, if you were to try to take any given right-wing broadcaster and say, how much of what Tucker Carlson says falls into one camp versus the other camp, or how many of Tucker Carlson's viewers fall into one camp or the other camp. I'm not sure that you could always do that very neatly. I do believe that if Christian nationalism had been restricted to the people that were attracted to the moral majority in the early 1980s, it would not have the cultural presence that it has today. And so clearly, in my view, the success of Christian nationalism that's associated with Trumpist populism depends on a larger coalition. Now, before we went on air, we were talking briefly about the definition of evangelical. And I do wonder, there's no way to prove it because we don't have enough data, unfortunately, on what people mean by evangelical. But I do wonder if this phenomenon, as you've said, of seeing a decreasing identification with the word evangelical among historically evangelical Northern institutions, among people with graduate degrees. A number of them have become very uncomfortable calling themselves evangelical. And at the same time, we have an increase in the percentage of people who are comfortable calling themselves evangelical in certain regions of the country, in the rural regions of the Bible Belt, for instance. There's a very strong identification with the word evangelical that apparently is much larger than the number of people who attend church, because when public opinion polls are asked, do you consider yourself evangelical or born again? And then do you attend church? There are a number of people that will put themselves in that camp of evangelical that will not attend church. And while historically church attendance hasn't been a requirement for using the term evangelical, it has been associated closely, of course, with people who practice their faith in certain ways, including church. And so I do wonder if what we're seeing is the extension of the term evangelical to encompass a wider phenomenon of Christian nationalism. And another evidence for this is that there have been studies that show that over time, that is over 5 years, I mean, it's hard to do a lifetime study on this phenomenon, but over the course of 5 years, people that identify, younger people that identify as Republican who are not religious become more religious. The converse is true for Democrats to a certain extent, but if that's the case, what it says to me is that while it's certainly true that the Christian nationalist term covers some things that are found well outside of church and well outside of a group of churched people, what you will see is both unchurched people starting to publicly identify with a religious group that they think shares their cultural leanings, and then some of those unchurched people even becoming churched, beginning to look for a church as they move more into this orbit. So I think I would see a relationship between the two.
Good. Well, we are two 20th century religious historians who are talking about Christian nationalism, and we can't avoid having to talk about the question of having a Christian founding, right? Did America have a Christian founding? Some of my survey students are reading Mark Hall's book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And his answer is yes, it did. But a number of historians, including myself, would be more inclined to say, no, it didn't have a Christian founding, but a lot of this has to do with how you define terminology and at what level you're looking at to answer that question. So I guess my question for you would be, how would you answer that question? Did America have a Christian founding? Maybe sub question to that is, does it matter? Does it matter whether we had a Christian founding or not for 2021?
Right. Yeah, you're right. It is a very complicated question, which makes it a great historical question. And it is true that a lot of it comes down to semantics. So I guess what I would say is let's break this down and try to approach it in different ways. What do we mean by Christian founding? So the first question would be, was assuming that by founding we're looking at this time period of the 1770s, 1780s into the maybe very early 1790s, but basically 1775 to 1791. So we could say that during that period, the framers of America's founding documents, particularly the Constitution, unanimously wanted to avoid the Puritan mindset of the 17th century. So none of them were attempting to create a restrictive covenantal community that would be directly accountable to God as a new Israel. So I think every serious historian who's weighed in on this would agree with that. I think we could also agree that nearly all of the founders, even the deistic-minded ones, would have identified as Christian. The term Christian would have meant different things to different people, but they thought of themselves as Christian, and they were operating within a culturally Christian context. And I would also say that I think that the popular view that the nation was founded mostly by deists depends on a definition of deism that is different from the one that people usually use. So if we ask the question, did very many of the founders believe in a clockmaker God who wound up the universe and left? The answer is no, hardly any of them did. In fact, even Thomas Jefferson believed in a providential God. He believed in a very rational God, a God that was not Trinitarian, but one that was more involved in the continued workings of the universe and holding people morally accountable than most people assumed deists believed. So there was a Christian context, Christian cultural context that shaped the assumptions of the founders. Now, within that, of course, Christianity, we need to remember, obviously, and of course, you know this extremely well, but as historians, of course, whenever we go back into the past, we need to understand what terminology might have meant and what the debates were. So today, when we're debating this term, usually the debates are over whether the nation is overtly Christian or whether it's religiously pluralist. And that, in many ways, is a mostly 20th century question, and of course 21st century question, but a question that emerged when a significant number of Americans, starting, I guess, in the early 20th century with liberal Protestants, but a significant number of Americans consciously thought of pluralism as a good thing, innately good thing that we want to preserve and expand, that the nation is stronger the more pluralist it is. And of course, that idea would come into conflict with the idea we've been talking about, the idea of Christian nationalism. I think to a certain extent that debate is a little anachronistic for the 1780s, because the notion of pluralism as a an innately human good, it is really mostly the product of the 20th century. But what the founders did believe was that they needed a working republic. And many of the founders believed that the more sectarian the nation was, the less of an opportunity that it would have for creating a working republic and protecting human rights, including, as both Jefferson and Madison very much saw, the right to religious freedom. So none of the founders were sectarians in the sense that they believed that the new republic would consist of a single religion. That is, even the most conservative or the most Calvinistic of the founders, people like Roger Sherman, for example, did not envision an establishment of congregationalism across all of the 13 plus new states. And so in that sense, they could all agree on the idea that there would be no religious test for public office, as the Constitution said. And they could agree on the principle of religious liberty, which would eventually be enshrined at the end of this founding period in the First Amendment, and was mostly protected even at the state level. So as you well know, of course, the Bill of Rights was written to limit the power of the federal government, protect the rights of the individual in the state against the federal government. It was not originally intended to restrict the power of the state governments, but state constitutions as well, for the most part, either created a full religious disestablishment, or at the very least, in the few states that had a continued religious establishment, the religious establishment was largely robbed of most of its power by a protection of the right to freedom of worship, even in those most established states like Massachusetts. You could be a Baptist in Massachusetts. You still had to pay tax money that would be used to support ministers of some sort. There was the established Congregationalist church, but there was freedom of worship, which was really a fairly radical idea. That was something that didn't exist in Virginia as late as the beginning of the 1770s. That Baptist ministers were put in jail because they weren't licensed ministers of the state, even at the very beginning of the 1770s. So this was a fairly decisive break with the idea of established church traditions. Now, I think everyone acknowledges that. The defenders of Christian nationalism do not, for the most part, or maybe even invariably, they do not want to create an established church. What they would argue, though, is that this disestablishment was promoted by people who took it for granted that the nation would remain Christian, maybe even Protestant, in a generic sense. And they would point to a number of statements of the founders, like George Washington's farewell address, for example, where he talked about religion and morality being inseparable supports for the new republic, and the republic not being able to survive if it lost that influence, or similar statements from John Adams and others. And I think we need to consider that evidence as well, and use that evidence to push back against a claim that has sometimes been made that this was a completely secular enterprise, as though all of the major founders could have easily and would have been members of Americans United or the ACLU or similar groups had they existed at the time. That in other words, that's what they wanted. And we need to remember that while there was no religious test for office at the federal level, there were religious tests for office at the state level. And the last one to survive, I guess, was the state of Maryland's requirement that one had to profess belief in a God or higher power up until it was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1961. So the idea that there might be certain religious beliefs, like atheism, that would be out of bounds for the Republic was certainly widely shared, at least among some people at the time of the founding. And there were, at the state legislative level, a number of people who expressed concern over how secular the new Constitution was. Even though the new Constitution did not prohibit states from having their own religious establishment or their own religious test for office, even that was not enough for some Americans, which I I think shows us how the idea that there had to be some recognition of a providential order for this founding and a religious order for this founding is something that actually does go back to the late 18th century. So how do we make sense of all of this? Well, I don't necessarily want to steal your thunder and in class as you weigh in on these contentious questions and tease all of these things out. And I think different people might divide the question in different ways. But I guess what I would say, just kind of as a shorthand, realizing this could be overly simplistic, is that religious beliefs of the founders varied. All or nearly all were at least vaguely Christian. Rationalism, the idea of the Enlightenment, informed almost everyone, even the most overtly religious or the most conservative Calvinists. And they believed that they could fuse the two in creating the new republic. They generally leaned more toward the side of keeping religion out of politics than in it, especially compared to the state of affairs that had existed just before the revolution. They recognized that in trying to unify this very diverse republic, that they would need to avoid the sort of contentious debates that they were well aware had polarized Europe and had led to wars in the past. And so, especially at the federal level, they wanted to avoid that overt intrusion of religion, which they identified with either church establishments or religious tests for office primarily. Having said that, most founders, or certainly many of the major ones like George Washington and John Adams and others, did believe that religion was an integral part of the republic. And while they did not believe that government should control religion, they did believe that government should encourage religion to thrive, that the republic could not exist in a purely secularized form. And that belief actually increased on the part of the Federalists over the course of the 1790s as they became alarmed at what was going on in France. And so George Washington's farewell address falls right in the middle of this debate about what was going on in France. And certainly over the next few years, by the late 1790s, even founders that had not been very religious before, like Alexander Hamilton, if they were Federalists, often became more religious. There was an increasing identification among the more conservative founders that gravitated toward the Federalist Party, an increasing identification between the security of the Republic and some form of religion, of Christian faith. But they did not believe that the government should dictate that. They believed that the government should create a situation in which that could flourish privately. On the part of the Jeffersonian Republicans, there was a much greater skepticism of that sort of government encouragement of religion. But nevertheless, Jeffersonian Republicanism received much of its support from evangelicals, from Baptists, from people who were very fervently religious and who envisioned religion thriving, but completely without the government taking an effort to promote it. Yet they certainly didn't view the government as something that should discourage religion either.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that's one of the best answers I've ever heard to that question you've given us. I mean, so much to think about in answering that question. So thank you. That was wonderful. So this is Constitution Day. We should talk about the Constitution. And I think you've already been kind of hinting around that. But as you were talking, I was thinking about reframing the question a little bit as I asked. And it was, is Christian nationalism and U.S. Constitution, are they compatible with each other? And this is very debatable question. You have people on one side who say, well, our Constitution is literally godless. It should be completely separated, separation of church and state, right? And then on the other side, it's no, the Constitution reflects almost a kind of covenantal theology. And so it's very much informed by Christianity. And without Christianity, the constitutional order won't hold. Something I was thinking about is maybe a way to reframe this question is it possible that at some points in our history that Christian nationalism and the Constitution were compatible, and that at some points not? You raise the issue of pluralism in the 20th century, right? I mean, some things were happening in the 20th century that had not happened before. An increasingly scientific worldview, scientific in the sense of being more hostile to kind of supernatural explanations of the world, but also increased immigration too, right? I mean, the immigration that's coming in the 19th century is largely still Christian, it's Catholic, but it's still Christian. When we come into the 1890s, we're talking about increasing populations of Jewish immigrants into the United States. Is it possible that a Christian nationalism that fits with the Constitution at a particular point of our history does not fit at other points?
That's an interesting question. I guess I'll start by saying clearly what the Constitution actually says or prohibits, and then we'll talk about whether this is compatible. So the Constitution really doesn't say a whole lot on religion, as I think you suggested, but it does contain the prohibition on religious tests for public office. So we cannot require that a president subscribe to the Christian faith or even to belief in God in order to run for office. And of course, we've had people who've been very competitive contenders who have not been Christian. Most have in a generally culturally Christian nation, but some have not, and certainly it's not at all a requirement. The second thing, perhaps even more famously, is with the First Amendment. The First Amendment prohibits the establishment of a religion, as well as anything that would restrict the free exercise of religion, and those are known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So the Supreme Court has, most of the religion cases, in fact, almost all of the religion cases at the Supreme Court for decades have focused on the First Amendment, and they've either been establishment cases or they've been cases of free exercise, and so and sometimes both, because oftentimes you'll have in the case of, say, classroom prayer, the claim is made on the one hand that if there's classroom prayer in the public schools, no matter how it's led or who conducts it or what exactly, or who is allowed to be exempt from it, there's still some form of the use of state resources, the use of public tax-supported resources to establish a religious exercise. And in general, that is how the Supreme Court has most of the time interpreted that. On the other side, of course, are those who say, well, but if you say that you can't have classroom prayer in public schools, then that restricts the right of people to exercise their own freedom of religion. What about all of those students who want to pray? That's that's how those cases are often argued. And so I don't necessarily want to get into all the nuances of these cases, but I'm just using that as an example of the way that those claims are made. So then the question is, well, if that's what the Constitution says, how does Christian nationalism fit into that? Well, the Constitution, while it does prohibit a religious test for public office, does not prohibit an individual voter from applying that test in their mind. So we might say that the claim that a leader should be Christian, which was actually a very mainstream evangelical and Southern Baptist claim in the 1970s. One can find that in numerous periodicals, Christianity Today and Southern Baptist periodicals at the state level. This was not a controversial claim. We might say that claim violates the spirit of the Constitution. Some people have certainly said that. What I think is also clear is that it can't possibly violate the letter of the Constitution. That is, you as an individual have the right to apply whatever test you would like in voting, no matter how prejudiced it might be. We might say that you would be morally wrong to decide that someone of a certain race or gender or ethnicity or any other quality does not have the right to be president or U.S. senator or a member of Congress. But that is your prerogative. You can vote the way that you want, and you don't have to tell people the reasons why you made that decision. So in that sense, that Christian nationalist view, if it's applied in this way, is not technically incompatible with the Constitution. It's not the sort of thing that a court could say is unconstitutional if it's applied, again, at the individual or rhetorical level. That is, if you write on your blog that you believe that America's leaders should be Christian, someone might say that that's incompatible with the spirit of the Constitution, but you have the right to say that and act on that as part of your constitutional rights as well. The other claim that's made about Christian nationalism, though, is that it is an effort to establish a religion, and in the United States, that is, establish Christianity as the unofficial religion of the US. And I think that's a more complicated claim. It certainly is true that it would be unconstitutional to give any sort of state favoritism to Christianity or any subgroup of Christians. However, if the form of state support comes through an inauguration prayer, for example, that mentions the name of Jesus Christ and is overtly Christian, that generally has not been viewed by courts as unconstitutional. What President Eisenhower did in leading his own inauguration prayer, or even what Rick Warren did when he was invited by President Obama to lead a prayer at the inauguration in 2008, and then spent about 15 seconds of that prayer, the last 15 seconds, explaining that he was praying in the name of Jesus. That is not technically an establishment of religion. At least it has not been viewed as such by the courts. So my own take on Christian nationalism is that most of what I see from Christian nationalism, again, it's a case-by-case basis, and we'd have to say, okay, what actions are we talking about? But most of Christian nationalism is not technically unconstitutional in the sense that it's not the sort of thing that would be thrown out by the courts. It is an attempt to keep the nation culturally Christian, and it's very much opposed to the direction of pluralism that the Supreme Court in the late 20th century embraced wholeheartedly. So in the 1950s, and especially in the 1960s and 1970s, the court tended in these cases of free exercise to try to impose some sort of secular standard, to say, let's purge the public spaces of anything that's overtly sectarian. And then in the 1980s, a slightly more conservative Supreme Court began, especially with the leadership of Sandra Day O'Connor, pushing for this in some of her decisions where she was a swing justice, began pushing more toward something that was culturally pluralist as an answer to complaints about secularism or sectarianism, to say that yes, a town hall could have some sort of Christmas scene that's overtly Christian, a creche, a scene with Jesus in the manger, as long as you also have the Hanukkah menorah and other trappings of non-Christian ways to celebrate the holiday season. And so if that's, and Christian nationalism would seem at least to be opposed to both of those. And so I do think it is definitely counter to the prevailing way that the Constitution has been interpreted by liberals and even moderate conservatives in the late 20th century. And for that reason, it does raise alarm bells in many people's mind, assuming that they take that pluralist reading of the Constitution. And it's an effort, both in its European version and its American version, to try to preserve a particular identity of the country that they believe is threatened by new demographic trends. In my view, they're largely wrong about whether it's really threatened by new demographic trends, but Christian nationalism in the United States and in Europe has been very closely associated with restrictive policies on immigration. The idea that if you have a change in the country, even if the immigrants coming in consist in many cases of Christians, most of those coming from Latin America across the Mexican border, for example, are Christian, but nevertheless, there's a fear of a cultural change and a fear of pluralism, whether that's fear is religious pluralism or even even racial or ethnic pluralism in some cases. And that, in many people's view, is a dangerous way to read the Constitution. Whether it's a historically accurate way to read the Constitution depends on which group you're looking at. Certainly nativism has a very long history in the United States of people who thought that they were acting within the dictates of the Constitution. But there's also, of course, a liberal tradition of reading the Constitution as a welcoming and pluralistic document. And that's where it's really against that interpretation that I think Christian nationalism has taken its stand.
Very good. Well, we've had a great conversation so far, but I think it's time to open it up for Q&A. We have maybe 15, 20 minutes or so. So at this point, if somebody wants to ask the question, I would say unmute and ask the question and mute back up.
To what extent was the Constitution shaped by Christian assumptions, for example, with respect to human nature with original sin, so that you have the balance of powers to control that? And there are folks who say that the drafters of the Constitution were heavily dependent on John Locke as an expression of the Enlightenment, but that Locke himself was very much informed by the Christian perspective.
Yes, I think that's a great question. So Locke was informed by the Christian perspective. He wrote actually a work of Christian apologetics, an entire book of Christian evidences. That said, Locke was also a very liberal Christian for his day, a theologically liberal Christian. He identified as an Arminian Christian, but was arguably Unitarian in some sense, though he never directly admitted it. And in the same way, I think the founders, as I mentioned, were almost invariably Christian in one sense or another. The majority of the founders, it's at least the majority of the founders that are well known, that people can name and say something about, tended to be rationalist Christians or Unitarian leaning Christians, Christians who almost invariably rejected the strictest version of Calvinism. There were a few Calvinist founders. So Roger Sherman was a Calvinist, and Samuel Adams, who did not sign the Constitution, but was someone who's very influential in the founding, was a strong Calvinist. They tended to be the exception rather than the rule. So the general trend in the late 18th century among this generation was to embrace Arminian interpretations of human nature that were influenced both by the theology of Jacob Arminius, which was transferred into Wesleyan theology in its evangelical form, and also maybe even more strongly by British Enlightenment assumptions, which were not nearly as secular as the French Enlightenment version in general. So the British Enlightenment tended to be pretty strongly Christian, but to have a more optimistic view of human nature. So the typical view of human nature that the founders had was the Arminian view. That is that humans are prone to sin, but not irredeemably corrupt. They did not believe in total depravity, and most of the founders that people would name among the first 3 to 5, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, others, James Madison, all of those people who were either liberal Anglicans or deistic leaning Anglicans tended to believe that humans could, through the use of reason, improve themselves. So yes, they did have a skeptical view of human nature in comparison to those people who say that there's no moral flaw in human beings. They did believe that humans were flawed. They might not have even believed at that point in a literal fall if they were people like Jefferson, but they believed that there was something wrong, and yet they also believed that there was something good in humans, and that humans should to use anachronistic language that comes from Abraham Lincoln, but listen to the better angels of their nature, that sort of thing. So I think that, yes, the balance of power for James Madison, who is more responsible than anyone else for coming up with this idea, is something that's very much compatible with an Orthodox Calvinist Christian view of human nature, and one that he would have heard at Princeton, because he was a student at Princeton, though he was never a Presbyterian. And I think that even as a very theologically liberal, deistic leaning nominal Anglican, he had this traditionally Christian skeptical view of human nature, but also a belief that through the use of reason, through the use of the balance of power and people acting in their own self-interest, that one could arrive at something that was a workable arrangement. And in many ways, that was typical of the English and Scottish Enlightenment. So Adam Smith, for example, a professor of moral theology at the traditional Calvinist, the traditional Calvinist Scottish university system, could come up with a rationale for a free market system that was based on the idea that people are fallen, but if they act in their own self-interest, society nevertheless is going to be better off as a whole. And so there was not a strong distinction between Enlightenment principles, Enlightenment reason, and some sort of traditionally Christian harmony of the doctrine of fallen human nature, and yet the idea that as people created in the image of God, we can reason and arrive at truth. And so, yes, I think it is appropriate to appeal to that and talk about that. And also, I think important to avoid the claim that some people have made that the founders were simply importing a Christian understanding of human nature into the Constitution.
Yeah, if I can just piggyback off that, you said compatibility, and I think that's the key to understanding that the checks and balances idea of the Constitution is very compatible with an original sin understanding of human nature, but direct influence is very problematic for intellectual historians like ourselves. Our students in national government just read Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, which I would encourage everyone to read. And Madison clearly, talks about human beings with a kind of flaw within them, but he doesn't want to appeal to theology. He wants a naturalistic explanation for what's going on. So, why is it that there's kind of an essential conflict between human beings? It's not because they're sinful, it's because there's an unequal division of property. Some people have no property, some people have a little property, and some people have a lot of property. And that's the basis of factions, which is the basis of conflict in our society. So, I mean, you see there that Madison, and I think this appeals to all the founders, they kind of, I guess the outcome of Christian theology they agree with, but how you get there, right? They're not content with supernatural explanations, right? They want naturalistic explanations for these doctrines. All right, we'll throw it back open for questions. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
Dr. Williams, this is Brent Ellis. I'm the president at Spring Arbor. I really appreciate your willingness to come and lead us in this discussion. I think it's a very important discussion, and I really appreciate the perspective in which you're bringing. One of the things that I would love to hear your opinion on, maybe a bit askew to the general scope of the topic, but I think it was mentioned earlier around the separation of church and state, and Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Dansbury Baptists, when it seemed like he was doing his best to attempt to convinced them that they did not need to fear the government and a federal government coming and telling them what they can and what they cannot practice and believe within the practice of their faith. And now how that is used in some ways to say, religion should not influence government. Really, I guess my perspective would be individually, and you even mentioned it, we, individually, we bring our faith and we bring our perspective, we bring our worldview into an assessment of where the candidates are. And so in some ways, faith naturally is a part of that process of election. And so how do you look at that statement from Thomas Jefferson then to the Dansbury Baptists around that separation? Would you look at that more as a separation of keeping faith out of government, or would you look at that more as saying government, as it clearly articulates in the First Amendment, government should not come in and limit the exercise of legitimate faith practice?
I guess I would see it as upholding. I would see it as an upholding of the doctrine of prohibition on religious establishment, somewhat narrowly defined. So the Danbury Baptists were concerned about this congregationalist power and they tended to be Jeffersonian because the Federalists wanted to uphold the power of this rival church system that had received state support for so long. So in both the Upper South, where there had been a traditional Anglican establishment, and in New England, where there was still a congregational establishment during Jefferson's presidency, Baptists tended to be attracted to the idea that there could be an open religious marketplace. So to put it in completely non-religious terms, it's kind of like in any antitrust case, the rivals of this company that's viewed as monopolistic are always happy when the government steps in to prohibit them from exercising dominance. And I think that was the case with the Baptists. Now, some 130 plus years later, this would be picked up by the Supreme Court, and the phrase wall of separation made much more famous when it was applied more broadly to, again, prohibitions on religious establishment, but this time not so much in terms of one particular church, but in terms of the use of state resources to impose a particular belief system. And that's where this would come into conflict now with of course, a completely different generation of evangelical Christians who saw the use of this phrase in that way as something that would restrict their religious liberty to try to keep their own cultural institutions, including the local public schools at times, culturally Christian. And that's why that phrase has become so contentious, and why its use has largely been weaponized, I would say, in the late 20th century. But its use in that context, of course, is trying to apply something that was written in a different context toward a context that didn't exactly exist. And whenever that happens, it's a contentious situation. Historians can shed light on it, but it's hard to know what Jefferson, one could guess, but it's hard to know exactly which side of the controversy would Jefferson take, and how exactly should that phrase be applied fairly. And in many ways, that the debates over that phrase are very closely parallel with debates about the meaning of the First Amendment itself. What does religious establishment mean? What does it mean to restrict free exercise? I think partisans on both sides agree with the principle that there should be no religious establishment, and that is no established church, especially, and that free exercise of religion should be protected. But but how exactly to draw those lines is the area of contention. You said one other thing that I think, just in passing, that I think is really important to note. So I want to make sure that I say that I agree with it here, and that is that we all bring our worldviews into politics, and that I think is a really key insight. And I think it needs to be reiterated. There is a notion in the United States that I believe is wrong, that secularization is essentially an empty public space that's completely neutral, and that the problem comes when people bring a religious point of view into politics. But of course, as you noted, we all bring a point of view into politics, and if those who insist on a secularized state are approaching that from particular worldviews, particular views about rights, particular views about how the universe works, particular views about the place of religion, all of those things are being brought to bear on their voting choices and their campaign choices. And the same is true for Christian nationalists and for Christians who are not Christian nationalists. We all bring points of view. That doesn't necessarily mean that every worldview is equally valid or has an equal right to compete in the same space. We have to, but we do have to talk about our worldviews. We do have to acknowledge them and recognize that none of us are coming at this from a neutral perspective. And so for that reason, I think the liberal ideal of the 1960s, which is that you could create a strictly neutral space, public space that would satisfy everyone simply by being purged of religion or totally religiously neutral, is something that's really not possible. And so however we approach this question, and maybe the pluralistic model of the 1980s is a bit more realistic, but however we approach this question, we have to acknowledge, I think, that there's no complete objective neutrality here, and that all of us are going to be reasoning from a certain perspective. We can't, to use a popular philosophical phrase, we can't reason from nowhere. We always have to reason from somewhere.
I know some people might be needing to head to class, but I think we will take one more question if Dr. Williams has time.
I guess I have a question, Dr. Williams. Oh, am I cutting out? I might be. This will move us away from the Constitution, but you hinted at the end about how Christian nationalists, particularly white Christian nationalists, have resisted demographic changes in the United States. How much is whiteness a part of the Christian nationalism that you and Dr. Edwards kind of laid out at the beginning of this conversation?
That's a great question. I think the answer is a large part. Now, African Americans often have what I would call their own version of Christian nationalism, which looks very different from the white Christian nationalist perspective. And maybe I should have been more explicit about that and saying that in my definition of Christian nationalism, I was talking about the idea of a majority culture, the idea that you would want to reclaim the 1950s, that you would want to go back to this Cold War civil religion is a claim I think that would only sound credible to someone who shared in that majority culture in the 1950s and wants a piece of it again. That said, obviously, African Americans have had a very different relationship to the nation, to the majority culture. They have also been very deeply religious, and their religion in general tends to be very overtly political and very justice focused. So when public opinion surveys have been conducted, and when sociological or even historical studies have been conducted to try to see what exactly is happening on the ground, they show that African American churches are far more comfortable than white churches on either the right or the left in endorsing political candidates very directly and inviting political candidates to speak and use church space to try to promote a particular political agenda. And the reason for that is that social justice has been viewed from the early 19th century to the present as intrinsic to African American theology. That this is what the church should be about. This is part of the mission of the kingdom of God, and it's interesting. I teach at the University of West Georgia, which is in the Bible Belt. It's also it's a state university, second tier state university, and our student population is about 35% African American. So you can imagine that we have a number of white Christian students and a number of Black Christian students, and it makes class conversations really fascinating when we're talking about religion and politics, because both groups of people tend to make the same claims, but apply those in political ways that are very different. So they might vote differently, but yet the same phrases will be used about needing to bring the country back to God. And especially when I have the students do interview projects with their families. So they interview a parent or grandparent, and invariably the African-American students will find when they're talking, one of the questions is about, that I encourage them to ask is what changes over the course of your lifetime do you think are positive and what changes are negative? And so numerous African-American grandparents of these students have said things like, well, the country is drifting from God. And it sounds very much like what I've heard from white evangelicals. And yet I know statistically, most of those people did not vote for Donald Trump. Most of those people are not identified with the Christian right. So there is this language that's used that transcends race, but the way that it is applied in the particular components are very much racially specific. So I think that's a great question. I think a full answer to that would require more time than what we have. But I think you've definitely touched on a point that really needs to be emphasized.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. I wonder if I should have entitled this Christian nationalisms in the U.S. Constitution, because there is no kind of one, even among white Protestants, right? There's a difference between, say, the Christian nationalism of the Klan of the 1920s and the Christian nationalism of the Federal Council of Churches in the 1920s, one which wanted to find a place for Jews in American life, and one that very much wanted to exclude it. So I imagine our conversations about Christian nationalism and how they fit into our politics will continue for a long time, but you've given us, Dr. Williams, you've given us a great perspective and some ground rules for having this conversation going forward. So I appreciate so much your time. Thank you everyone for coming out. There will be a recording for this at some point. And yeah, thank you everyone.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.